Welcome to the Myth and Magic Authors Podcast, folklore and fantasy topics aimed at creative storytellers. To write stories and challenge your brain with exciting ideas, delve into these presentations and reflections. See how fantasy realms are based on actual world history, legend, and lore. Study fairy tales, nature fables, and supernaturalism to engage in a jumble of concepts that will trigger your fancy and get you writing imaginatively. Now, here's your host, Neil Mack.
Hello, fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, right at the end of the month of March, and we're approaching April and we're approaching Easter. But today I've got a really exciting show for you. We've got the amazingly talented Krista Wallace, who's the author of the Gatekeeper series, and she's a voice artist, a narrator, and a sword fighter, so we can learn lots from her. So I'm speaking from London, England, just up from Windsor Castle on the River Thames, and she's speaking from British Columbia in Canada. So without further ado, let's go over and say hello to Krista.
How you doing, all right? Good morning.
Good morning. Good afternoon. You are 4:00, I think we decided.
It's lovely to see you, Krista.
Oh, nice to meet you.
So, how you been? All right?
Yeah, not bad. Keeping busy despite, everything that is weird in the world today.
Going on. It's mad, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I'm speaking from Staines, which is a town on the River Thames, about 5 miles away from a 1,000-year-old castle where a queen currently lives, a real-life queen.
Yeah.
I live in a town which was set up in year 43 AD by the Romans. So I live in a kind of fairy tale place.
Wow.
Fantasy is all around me.
You do,
and
yeah.
You're in Vancouver, is that right?
Just outside of Vancouver. So it's about a half an hour, 45-minute drive, depending on traffic. I'm actually in Port Coquitlam, which it's actually the town I grew up in. So it's such a lovely little city that we call it the Port Coquitlam Vortex. So if you grew up here, a lot of people wind up coming back here to live. So yeah.
So you're surrounded by the legend, I suppose, and mythology of the First Nations anyway.
Yeah, I would say we are surrounded by it. I would not say I grew up with any kind of knowledge of that folklore mythology. It's something I'm starting to become more tuned into and knowing that I need to learn more. But I'm certainly surrounded by, rivers and mountains and many, many very tall trees, which to me is kind of, I love your part of the world, and I definitely am inspired by those kinds of settings as well. But I also love going out and hiking in the woods and on the mountains and find that to be something that really gets under my skin.
I'm excited to talk to you, not only because obviously you're a wonderful fantasy author and I've looked at some of your work, but obviously also I think it's very important for me to get my head around the fact that you're narrating your own work, and I want to chat about that shortly.
Yeah, sure.
But also wanted to go into more detail about your outcast sword fighter named, is it Kaya Hallidan?
It's Kier, actually.
Kier Hallidan.
Yeah.
That's in your Gatekeeper trilogy.
Gatekeeper, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to chat about some of the aspects to do with that.
Sure.
But first of all, let's just explore a bit more about you.
I studied theatre.
So tell us a bit about, because you've been on the stage, you've been a director, haven't you, as well as being
I've done a little bit of directing. I've done more work as a musical director. So as my kids were going up through elementary school and high school, I would help out with the plays at the school. And because I have a music background as well, it was a natural fit for me to step in and help with the singing and teach the kids the music and that sort of thing. So that's something I've just done with young people. I haven't done that in sort of a more formal professional setting with adults, and that it's definitely something that that I really, really love to do. It's, I kept on helping at the high school long after my own kids finished. So it was about 3 or 4 more years before I finally went, you know what, I need, that's taking up a lot of my time, and I need to go back to just focusing on my writing and my own creations. So
how old are your kids now?
My kids are 27 and 24.
Wow. Congratulations.
Oh, that I kept them alive this long.
Yeah, well done.
Thank you very much.
Being a creative person, we spend a lot of our time imagining stuff, trying to bring our imagination to the attention of the public. I suppose you've been able to do that through your music as much as your writing.
Yeah. I mean, I started out, I've been a singer for, well, my whole life. I come from a fairly musical family, and I always knew I wanted to go into theater, and my kids both went into theater, and my husband's in theater. So that whole creative side and performing side was a natural progression. But yeah, I sang, as you pointed out, that I sang in the Vancouver Bach choir for about 4 years. I always sang in choir all through school and stuff. And I love singing choral music, and I miss that, but you just can't do everything. So the Vancouver Bach choir is a classical choir with about 150 people. And then I had also sung jazz in high school. So when I was asked to be the vocalist for a local big band, I started doing that. So I've been singing with the big band for about, well, close to 25 years, I guess. Yeah, and I had a rock band for about 12 years, and now I sing. I have a jazz duo as well as the big band. So those have all been, we're all on hiatus because we can't perform really, and we can't rehearse because we can't get together. So we're all looking forward to getting back together, and everybody's bemoaning the fact that we miss making music. Yeah.
Well, that's the good thing about being a writer, is that really a writer is just basically a hermitage. You just try to keep yourself well away from everybody else, and just basically just you and your imagination.
Yeah, I mean, I miss. I do a lot of going on retreat. I have lots of writer friends, and I go and we hang out together for a weekend and write, or going to conventions and things like that. I miss.
So going really on about writing. So when did you first start writing?
I didn't pick up writing until I was about 30. It's one of those things where you meet people who are, I always wanted to be a writer, and from the time I was a child, that's what I wanted to do. But no, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an actor and a musician, and I do those things. Yeah. But then I guess what got me started writing was a friend of mine. He wrote a little novelette, I guess. It was a fairly short thing, and he had a bunch of friends read it and critique it for him, and he really appreciated the fact that I didn't just say, oh, it was great. I actually kind of took it apart a little bit and said, these are the things that I see as problems. And seeing that he did that made me think, I'd kind of like to try that. And it's kind of a goofy cliche, but we did play a fantasy role-playing game, and so I took some of the characters from there and some of the adventures, but I recognize that you can't just write down a campaign and that's a story. So I just kind of borrowed from that. And because I thought, we're creating some kind of neat stories here with this game. And so that's kind of where it started. And a lot of my characters are based on the characters that were created by my friends and I. But then I went with it, and I turned it into something that is actually a story now.
So is that the Gatekeeper trilogy then? Yeah,
that's how it started. Yeah. But most of it is from my imagination. There are just little elements of it that came from the game.
So when did what sort of drew you into fantasy fiction generally? I mean, what sort of writers first inspired you?
Oh, well, definitely The Hobbit was one of the first ones. It's such a I'm trying to remember. I didn't even know that the name fantasy as a genre, and until I was probably in my 20s or something like that. I didn't even, I was always drawn to stories that involved magic, or if I saw a show on TV where, oh, there's sword fighting, I want to see what that is, A Wrinkle in Time was one of my favorites, and it makes it sound like I never read any fantasy at all. I liked ghost stories. I liked there's The House with the Clock in Its Walls by John Bellairs, and lots of other stories like that kind of are spine chilling and make you go ooh. Though I'm not at all drawn to horror. That's not my thing. But I actually read a ton of other stuff. Like I read a lot of murder mysteries, and I've read Jane Austen over and over. I read Pride and Prejudice about every 18 months or so.
Very, very sensible.
And then I discovered Neil Gaiman, and I discovered Jasper Fforde, whom I love, and I got to meet him. I've met lots of really interesting writers through conventions and things like that. That's always great. Who else? Stephen Bruce is another one of my favorites, because I like his humor and his sort of swashbuckling. So it's really, I think you can't help but be influenced by the stories that you read. I would say one of the reasons, going back to kind of why I started writing too, was I had read, there was a whole series of books that I was reading, and I was finding it annoying because there would be pages and pages of the main character waffling over whether they should go on the journey or whether they should just stay home. And then later, of course, they're going to go on the journey or else there isn't a story. So why are you wasting my time with that? And then they're halfway through the journey and they're still waffling over, should I have come or should I have stayed home? Like, stop it. And then there were very few female protagonists. And maybe I was just reading the wrong books. Like, there are probably other really good ones out there, but I hadn't discovered them. And I was frustrated by the female characters who would always take the back seat or defer to the male characters around them. And, come on, we need some strong women in there. So that was kind of what got me started, was writing something that addressed those issues that had come up for me as a reader. So your main protagonist in your Gatekeeper trilogy is a woman. I guess she's the person that I would like to be, you could say. And I've had other readers say, wow, I wish I had her, her courage, because she says what she thinks. She speaks her mind. And I think she's the person that I wish I could be. I'll have to leave that up to some other people who know me and are reading the book.
Can you do your elevator pitch for the Gatekeeper trilogy?
Oh my gosh, it's been so long since I've done an elevator pitch. Okay, so Kier Halladin walked out of a cornfield at the age of 3, and 20 years later, she's trained as an elite sword fighter and leaves home to find out who put her there. And on the road, she makes mistakes, she meets people, she gets in a duel in a tavern, and he cheats. Her opponent cheats twice, so she kills him. Good. And after that, she is invited, the duel happens to be witnessed by one of her greatest heroes, who then invites her to work for him. But what she didn't think about at the time was that the fellow she killed also had powerful friends who now want to know why she killed him. And so now they're on her trail to find out what's going on. And now they found out that she works for Valraker, and so now they think that she killed him under his orders.
I like
there you go.
Good, that's a nice pitch. Good pitch. So picked up then that she moves from a cornfield onto the quest almost. And something that I've been very interested in, I've been talking about over the last year, is about what I think is the most important element of fantasy, which is the moment of liminality, where we move from one threshold into another, into the fantasy world.
I actually listened to one of your episodes about that. So I found that interesting. And then you were saying, hey, so what is your opinion on that? And so I've been thinking about that, actually. So Now the thing with Kier having walked out of a cornfield, that's certainly not the start of this story. Once she learns more about where she comes from, she finds out that what that was all about.
Yeah.
But sorry, what was the word again? Liminality?
Liminality, yeah.
Liminality.
The liminal moment is the threshold between two different states of being.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would suggest that pretty much all stories, that is the essential element of a story, be it fantasy or anything else. Because I was thinking, you wonder, okay, why this character? Why is this story about this character, or from this character's point of view? Why is this person important? And then you also think about, why now? Why are we looking at this moment in this person's life? And I think it's because that story begins with that limit moment that you're talking about. So I agree that that's an essential element of a story.
Is there a moment where you, as the author, pass from real life and into the fantasy world? You see my point?
And I've just never even thought about writing that way. But I suppose when I sit down to create the next part of the story, there is that moment when you just really sink into it, and you can write in that character's viewpoint and see the world that she sees, or he, because I switch points of view all the time.
Yeah.
So I guess, if that's answering your question, when I really sink down into the world that I'm creating, that can be quite a strong feeling. But as for, so now we're talking about two different things, because there's the character passing through that moment. In my stories, there isn't really sort of a real world versus fantasy world. The whole world is all one. Yeah. Some people can perform magic and some people can't, and some people are better at it than others. But Kier's liminal moment then is the duel, and then when she's offered the opportunity to work for her hero. So that is, of course, why the story begins now and not 2 years before or something like that. So, but for me, when I get really, really into writing, it's quite an amazing feeling. Do you get that too? Where you come out of a session of writing and your head is buzzing, and you almost have to kind of look around and go, oh yeah, what do I have to think about now in the real world?
So two things that come out of that, which I'll be interested to quickly talk about. One is the world building. You know, do you actually are you one of these people? There are many out there who draw maps and you've got huge plans.
And I know exactly what you're talking about. Because the story was influenced from the RPG that we used to play, we have a whole bunch of maps that we created. So again, my world is based on that, but not, I've fudged it around to suit my needs. But it's helpful to kind of have that as a visual. I've certainly done a lot of thinking about what's the technology in my world? What does government look like? I would not say that I sat down and wrote essays on this sort of thing or jotted notes down. I spent more time interviewing my characters and getting to know them and how they feel what they feel their place is in the world. So I think world building, I totally agree. I think there are some people that sit down and do a whole bunch of world creation before they even start. Whereas mine is, well, I'm very much involved in my characters, so I experience the world as my characters do. And there are many, many things that I have discovered just as I'm going through the world of the story. I'm not a planner. I'm not a plotter. I'm a classic make it up as I go along kind of person, which gets me into trouble now that I'm writing the final book and I have all these loose ends that I have to tie up. Oh no, how am I going to do this? I'd kind of like to give the reader/listener a satisfying ending.
So how's that going? So that's the last part. How have you got on with that?
Oh man, I think I can see, for years, literally years, I have been working on this final book. And part of it was that intimidation of having to bring the whole thing together. And the other part was just not actually having any idea what the story arc of this final book is. I mean, each section of the book needs its own story arc, and the whole series needs a story arc. And so for literally years, I felt like I was in a little round boat. I think of Ben Gunn from Treasure Island and his little round boat, but I was in an ocean with no land in sight and just fog. And I was just floating around, paddling and trying to find some point of contact somewhere. And as I worked through and I played around, like, just, okay, here's an idea for a scene. So I'm just going to write this and see what happens. And it's funny how many of those scenes that I wrote when I was just mucking about and trying to figure out what this book is about, a lot of those are actually making it into the story. So that's really cool. But it took so long, achingly long, to finally feel like my little boat was headed into a smaller body of water and a stream, you know, with land on either side and islands, so that I knew where I was going. It's taken so long. But I finally feel like I'm getting close. And I've written enough words for a full-length novel already. And I'm just trying to piece together how they fit, and where are the gaps, and where are the things I haven't addressed yet. And I know that I will have to write a lot of transition scenes and things like that. But it's finally coming together. What a monster.
And just an aside, have you got another project in your head just like there waiting to take off afterwards?
Yeah, well,
oh wow,
I have another standalone that I've written. So it's not like I've only been working on this project my whole life. I have a standalone called Griffin and the Spurious Correlations. That is a contemporary humorous fantasy romance. It was just going to be a contemporary fantasy, but I could not write it without humor. And then when I was finished writing it, I realized, actually, this is a romance. I think I need to embrace that. Don't try to fight it. It is what it is. I wrote the story that it needed to be. So I'm definitely looking forward to podcasting that one and eventually publishing it. And then, of course, once I'm finished, you were probably asking more about what writing projects I have. You were asking before about my paranormal romance, which I began and then set it aside. And there are a couple of other projects that I started writing with some interesting characters. And I've got a number of things that I started writing and then thought, no, I really need to finish this one. You certainly have to complete it. That's kind of a good rule. I think that's what Neil Gaiman said, write something, finish it. I've had this conversation a lot with other writer friends about how the traditional publishing industry has changed so much. And, you know, I did have an agent for a while, but then I let that go. And I was offered a contract from a small press, and then I wasn't really that keen on the detail anyway. I let that go. And then you get to thinking about all of this art you've created, these stories that you've created, and how they're languishing here on my computer, you know, this thing, they're or hard copy on a shelf over there. They're just hanging out there, not doing anything. And they need an audience. It's like rehearsing a play and then never performing it. There's no release. There's no reward of having that reaction. And so I'd been thinking for a while about doing a podcast. And then I was at World Fantasy in LA, actually, in November of 2019. And so I started floating this idea around. It's something that I'd been thinking about for ages, but if you know me, you'll get this when I say it was like, well, I have this idea, but it was my idea, so it can't possibly have been a good one. So I needed to kind of ask out and see what other people thought. And they're like, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. It's a good idea. You should do that. Well, and then COVID happened. And so here's a thing I can do. People need stories, and I have some, and it's something that I can do sitting here in my house. I mean, I had done some audiobook narration before that. Reading aloud is something that I've always loved to do. My folks read aloud to me when I was a kid, and I always read aloud. I started reading aloud to my own kids when they were about 6 months old. They have very fond memories of being read aloud to, and I've always loved that, even when I was a small child. And I actually got my first publishing contract because of reading aloud. Oh. And I actually got my first audiobook contract because of reading aloud at a convention. So that was through a friend of mine named Brian Rathbone, who writes tons of his own amazing stuff. And he was at this convention and heard me reading aloud and said, I'd like you to audition for this thing. So my first audiobook is called Ascension, and it's by a different author named Morgan Rich, who has written in Brian Rathbone's world. And so he helped set me up with the technology I needed and how to do it. And I just started doing that and experimenting and learning about the editing process and all of that. So then it was a natural progression for me. So when I got the idea to start the podcast, I already knew how to do all that. So that was how I got into that. And the idea from the start was I can podcast a chapter a week. And then once I'm finished podcasting it, then I can put it out as an audiobook. My idea all along had been to have some interviews with other writers and other people, and maybe have other people contribute some of their own readings. So that was always the plan. So after I finished Gatekeeper's Key, I have 3 episodes, which are interviews with, well, I call them chats with cool folk, because I know a lot of really interesting people. So the first one is with my writer friend and sort of writing partner, Jonathan Lister. He writes science fiction and all kinds of other really crazy, interesting stuff. He and I collaborated on the 3-day novel contest. I know you do NaNoWriMo, which I've tried a couple of times, but we've done the 3-day novel contest, which starts at midnight on Friday night and goes to midnight on Monday night. And we were living in different cities at the time, so we would be in contact with each other. It was a hoot, staying up all night and writing. And that was fun. I don't think there's sort of a word count goal. The goal is just to complete a novel. Until you
break down.
Yeah. Oh, and ours is utter rubbish. Like, it's just terrible. It's hilarious, and you can tell we haven't slept for 3 days, but it was worth doing. Anyway, so my first chat is with him, and we had a good time. And then we happened to go up north to where my daughter lives, and we've got some friends up there. So I did a couple of chats with groups of people that I know up there. One of whom I know from theater school. She was the only other woman in my graduating class. There were 5 of us, and she was the only other woman. So it was neat to sit down with her and her husband and talk about theater and the world and writing. And so those are my chats with cool folk, which I always intended to do more of. But I also, you can probably speak to this, I also had no idea how much more difficult the editing would be. The editing is difficult in a different way. When I'm editing me reading, I know at least where the breaks are and how to cut out the mistakes and things like that. But when you're having a chat with somebody and you have sort of a time limit of how much you have to fit it in, so you have to go through the chat and kind of choose the most important points that are being discussed and then cut out the editing was a real challenge on the chats. So
in addition to the podcast, you've also put the first book, haven't you? And was it the second book as well, onto another platform? What platform was that?
I submit them through Findaway Voices, and so then Findaway distributes them. So they're available on Chirp and Google Play and Apple and Kobo and a few other things. find a way, makes them available to the audiobook retailers, but not every audiobook retailer will pick them up. So I don't have control over that.
Very quickly, have you got any sort of tips you would give to sort of like somebody who's just thinking about starting out doing a bit of voice work, even if they just want to read their own stuff out?
Right. Well, I think it's important to have a decent microphone. Like any time you go and look on a YouTube video about how to start doing a podcast or whatever, get a decent microphone. This is not what I use for my audiobook stuff. I hope it's okay, but you need a space in which to work. So this is also not my recording room.
Have you got a proper studio to work in?
I wouldn't say it's a proper studio. I have my walk-in closet. Yes. I have my walk-in closet, which has a whole bunch of foam and stuff all around to help with the soundproofing. Although it still doesn't help when there are cars starting up on my street or little airplanes going by. Yeah. And then beyond that, there are a number of different ways, different schools of thought on how to read your work or somebody else's work. I asked people's opinions about whether they wanted to listen to me read them a story or if they wanted me to kind of change the voices a little bit. And I did a bunch of research online and stuff like that, just audiobook narrators, changing the voices and things. I did kind of fall into giving my characters slightly different voices. I'm limited to what I can do because obviously with a female voice, it's harder for me to do. And I don't want to talk like this, trying to sound like a man. That doesn't sound good. It sounds goofy. So it's more important to me to be in that character. And I guess I approach it kind of from an acting perspective, where if I'm going to be this character, what kind of a person am I? And how do I speak? How do I carry myself? It isn't so much the sound of the voice as it is the tempo, or is there sort of a sing-song aspect to the way this person speaks? Is this person kind of arrogant or haughty? And so is there a different kind of a different tone to how this person speaks? So I think it's more about hearing the character's voice in your head because they're a real person and speaking the way they speak, the way, in the same way that a writer should be paying attention to the way the people around them speak and how each person has a different kind of voice. There's a different way there's different slang that they use. There's different choices of words and all that kind of stuff you need to pay attention to when you're writing characters, you're writing your dialogue for characters. You need to do the same thing when you're narrating the characters, is just knowing who that character is and how they speak.
The other thing I wanted to ask you, because you're an actor and you've been on stage, I know that you've been on musical stage, but you've probably done a bit of Shakespeare. Have you ever done any sword fighting? Because your protagonist, she's a sword fighter, isn't she? And so I wanted to ask you about that. What's your actual experience of sword fighting?
That's a really good question. I did some stage fighting back in the day. Yeah. And I've done lots of workshops on sword fighting. So at NorwestCon and Creative Inc. is another local one. There's a marvelous place here in Vancouver called Academy Duello, and they actually teach sword fighting skills and other kinds of fighting skills. I have never actually signed up and taken their courses. It's something that I wanted to do, but I just never got around to it. But I have gone to workshops at conferences and things where they have come in and shown the weapons and talked about armor and all that kind of thing. I've also been to lots of panels and stuff talking about writing fight scenes. So this is about how you choreograph a fight scene in your story. And one of the most important things I learned through all of that is that we don't need to focus on, and this is why I can get away with not being a sword fighter. So you need to focus more on the the character's goal and the obstacles, and what's the reason for the fight? What's their emotional state?
Yeah.
And what are the stakes of this fight? What's going to happen if they lose? Why does this matter to them? So it's more character stuff than it is about the nitty-gritty, each little detail of the choreography. Some of the choreography of the fight is important, and you need to be aware of that. The same way that there's choreography in a scene where there's more than one person in a room. And I think of that as choreography, even if there's not a fight going on. It's knowing where your characters are in the space and how they interact with each other. And, you know, if they're sitting in this chair, they can't just reach over to the kettle that's over there. There's some space involved. So you have to think about those things as a writer. And so same thing with the sword fight. You need to think about, what do I actually mean when I say they thrust and twisted the wrist, and what the other character's response is. Kind of have to stand up and sort of play it out. I had a lot of help from one of the people who's an instructor at Academy Duello, read my opening fight scene and gave me a lot of pointers on it. She said it was actually a really good fight scene, don't worry, but she gave me some pointers on how to fix it. And it taught me how to think about the fight scene a little bit differently. When I first wrote it, I was all just hack and slash and dodge and parry, but then she actually made some points that got me to thinking about, okay, what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? And so if that happens, how does the other fighter have to respond in order to turn the blade? So you need a little bit of that kind of detail, but what's more important is the actual character stuff, the character emotion and the stakes and all of that stuff. Like, one thing that speaking of fighting and the fight scenes and learning how to do that is research. I really enjoy talking about all the different kinds of research you can do for writing a book and how to use that information. I really love using Google Street View. So, for instance, my paranormal romance that I mentioned actually takes place, it begins in Pitlochry in Scotland.
Oh, yeah, I know Pitlochry, I've been there.
My favorite Scotch is Edradour, which comes from Pitlochry.
Yeah. Smells. When you walk, have you been there to Pitlochry?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah, when you walk around, you can smell whiskey the whole time. It's in the air.
That's why we were drawn to it, because our travel book said you can smell the whiskey. Okay, we're going there. So yeah, there are all kinds of different ways that you can find out information that you need. And I don't tend to do research until I need to. I will start writing, and when I come across something that I need to know more about, I'll put it in brackets and come back to it and just carry on. And you can fall down the research rabbit hole, speaking of Alice in Wonderland, and be caught up in doing research for hours and hours and hours. And then you have to decide, okay, what was the piece of information I needed? Obviously, doing research and knowing more about a thing allows you to add richness to your storytelling, but you also don't want to put every single thing you learned.
You've just been showing off then, aren't you?
That's right. That's right. It's damn well going to hear about all the things I learned. Yeah. So the research part can be really super interesting. Most recently, I was doing research into guerrilla warfare, such as in Vietnam, because I have a bunch of farmers. I need to know what kind of farming implements will make good weapons. So yeah, it's really interesting to look up all of these things and stuff, but then you have to just kind of take what you need and put that in the book, not all of it. But I do find it an interesting pursuit.
So anyway, how do the readers and the listeners get your work and get your words, and how do they find out more about you?
Okay, well, my podcast is called Totally Fantastic Title. Yeah, well, it's got brackets around it because I actually just stuck it in there as a placeholder, because I wasn't sure at what point in the creation of a podcast you have to actually commit to a title. And so I thought, okay, so at some point we're going to come up with some totally fantastic title. So we stick that in there, and and then, oh, I guess that's what I've committed to. So it was kind of an accident, but it works. I like it. Totally fantastic title. If you typed in that, you would find it on Podbean or Spotify or, podcast platforms. Krista Wallace.com is my website. My podcast is available through there too. There are links to the audiobooks. You can look up, probably looking up Krista Wallace to find my audiobooks is the best way to find them. There are links to those also on my website as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So, well, good luck with your part 3 and the final curtain of the Gatekeeper trilogy.
Yeah.
And then good luck with all your future projects. I'm looking forward to listening and hearing all about the.
Yeah. Thank you. I should explain that it's become a trilogy in 4 parts because book 2 is just very, very long. So I'm publishing it as, kind of like Lord of the Rings was originally 1 book and he divided it in 3. Yeah, so Gatekeeper's Deception is just so long that it made more sense to actually publish it as 2 separate volumes. So it's book 2 and 3. Gatekeeper's Deception Deceiver is available in audiobook. We are currently in the second half. So that's Gatekeeper's Deception Deceived. So, and I'm writing Gatekeeper's Revelation.
Wow. We'll have to talk again and when it's all finished and talk about, what happens next and what the experience of finishing the whole project was.
Oh,
how you're getting on.
Oh, I'd love that. Yeah, that would be fun.
So it's been really good. Thank you very much for spending the time doing it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Neil. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.